I'm in your heart always, that much is true. And I'll always love you, I promise you to. Please say goodbye. Don't ask why. I can hear you crying. Please will you stop? Just keep trying, smiling. You can get through this someday. You'll be okay. Someday you'll be okay.
Hi, you guys. Welcome back. This is Richard Sachs. I'm your host on Lost Arts Radio, and we're back with Joel Skousen for episode 3 of our History of the Deep State series that I think is going to be spectacular when it's all done here. Should help a lot of people understand where what we're dealing with now all came from and what the sequence was of development. And this one we're going to call, at Joel's request, the Cold War Years. And remember that Joel is the editor of World Affairs Brief. And if I understand right, Joel, can people still get a free copy by requesting one from you?
That's right. They just email me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com, and I'll send them the latest issue.
That would be great. I highly recommend that people read that, so take advantage of the offer. And Joel's also the author of The Secure Home and Strategic Relocation, which is a great book that I happen to like a lot. And the site is worldaffairsbrief.com. We're going to continue talking about history of the deep state and took up where we left off last time. So thank you, Joel. This is an exciting series. Let's do the next part.
Well, as we talked about in the previous series on the war years, the deep state was deeply involved in not only World War I, but to a much, much deeper extent during World War II, which was operated under the aegis of the United Nations even years before the charter was written, and it was formally organized as an organization. The government was using the term United Nations in a lot of their communications. And of course, the Roosevelt administration was full of globalists and communists like Alger Hiss and Mr. Lamont and others that were that followed on into the Truman administration after Roosevelt died. But we lost a lot of liberty in the world after the Truman administration took over. The biggest affair was, as we covered at the end of that, the betrayal of all of the Eastern European people into Stalin's hand, as well as those that had escaped into the West, including soldiers, white Russian soldiers that had fought for Germany in order to help defeat communism, had been turned over and betrayed by Churchill to Stalin, and most of them died in the gulags. I also covered the fact that the United States knew that Stalin kept about 6,000 U.S. prisoners of war, American soldiers that had been liberated from East German camps, as hostages to see that the U.S. would follow through with their betrayal of the Eastern Europeans back to Stalin. And they kept about 8,000 British prisoners secret. They kept this from the West. They have never revealed those secrets or admitted them to the West. That Stalin never released them even after the U.S. followed through with Operation Keelhaul. So these are great evils and disasters in human history, which, and when you look at the cover-up of that, that's an indication of the deep state. Clear back then that they controlled the media and governments, though not even to the greatest extent as they are today. It's grown an awful lot since then, but they did have power. There's a very interesting war series on BBC television called Foyle's War, which has some pretty good episodes in them. They do cover Operation Keelhaul in one of the episodes of how terrible it was that the British were handing over by force all of these Russians who had escaped Stalin during the war and handed them back over. So I was really surprised that the BBC would put out that kind of a series and be open about that.
What do you think was the motive for doing that? Do you have any idea, or did they talk about it at all?
No, they would never openly breach that there was a conspiracy, but they did highlight the great human tragedy. They showed people trying to commit suicide rather than go back to the Soviet Union. They showed British soldiers bludgeoning these people to keep them on the trucks as they hauled them out to go back to Soviet Russia. I believe the theory was, of course, that the globalists wanted to build a future enemy, and that's why they made this deal with Stalin and gave him so much Lend-Lease aid, which far exceeded even what he needed. I mean, we built truck factories, we built tank factories for them, we gave them aircraft even when our own soldiers didn't have the material. We gave them washing machines and sewing machines. Why is that necessary for military Lend-Lease, to deprive American women of all those appliances and ship them over to the Soviet Union? Trying to build the best enemy that money can buy, as the late Dr. Stanley Monteith used to say. And as I covered, even after the war ended, we continued to ship Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, including the remaining plans to the nuclear weapons and the first shipment of enriched uranium, because the Russians didn't know how to enrich uranium to build their own weapons. So that Russia could explode their first nuclear weapon a year after Hiroshima. So that is where we left off last time, and the first major betrayal that happened in the Truman administration was the betrayal of Free China under Chiang Kai-shek. As you remember, Chiang Kai-shek rose to power after in World War II with American help defeating the Chinese, but he had this growing insurgency that he was facing from Mao Zedong, with Soviet arms being shipped to Red China to try to take control over China over World War II. And the State Department under Dean Acheson, who was a globalist, put out a white paper on China complaining about the corruption within the nationalist Chinese regime under Chiang Kai-shek. Well, China has always been a country of warlords, a great deal of corruption. And look at it now. I mean, corruption in the communist country of China is just rampant, and they even have to discipline their own cadres. It's the same in the Soviet Union. The original oligarchs were the communist leaders during the pre-fall years. So there's always been corruption within communist governments, and always will be, because it's a satanic, evil conspiracy to take away liberty. But he wrote this white paper to basically undermine confidence in the government of Chiang Kai-shek. And that's when George Catlett Marshall, who was in charge of World War II, he was a globalist, took charge of the foreign policy, and as the emissary of Truman, went over to China and demanded that Chiang Kai-shek form a coalition government with the communists. And we have a known history of what happens when you form a coalition government with the communists. They always take over. They use their government authority then to take power. But Chiang refused, knowing the history of what happens when you join forces with the communists. And so Dean Acheson and George Marshall cut off military aid to Chiang Kai-shek.
Wow.
While the Soviet Union continued to ship in tons of arms and ammunition to Mao Zedong. So it now became a one-sided battle. Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers began to defect. Their morale was very low. They were low on food and had no ammunition. And that is one of the reasons, by the way, that the globalists gave for the fall of China, is that because of the corruption of Chiang Kai-shek, his soldiers were deserting him. Well, they were deserting him because they weren't given any arms and ammunition. How do you fight the communists when that's the real reason they were deserting, not because they didn't have confidence or weren't part of the liberty movement to save China from communist domination. And so China fell, and there were all the purges of Mao Zedong, tremendous purges, millions of people killed who were aligned with the nationalist movement. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan with as many people as he could, but those who stayed behind were put into prison camps or murdered. So it was a massive murder.
I have a question about that too, and that's that these figures, excuse me, are often cited of anywhere from 80 to 110, 120 million, something like that, killed by the communist rulers in China over time. And it's very seldom specified how they were killed, if they were just people starving because of lack of food, or, like you said, people picked up because they were known supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, or, how does that break down, and what are the real numbers, do you think?
But it's hard to know what the real numbers are because, there wasn't any freedom of the press in China under Mao. And so a lot of this had come out from the nationalist Chinese, who kept track of their relatives who had disappeared into the camps and compiled these figures. There were two things, as in the Russian Revolution, where they starved the Ukrainians. Over 30 million kulaks, as they called them, or Ukrainians, were starved to death. They literally came in and took all the food there and literally starved, estimated 30 million people. In total, Stalin was guilty of killing at least 60 million people, counting those that he rounded up and put in prison camps where they were starved systematically, worked to death, disease took their toll. And there were a lot of people shot with bullets in the back of the head, who were leaders and who were wealthy people who had to be removed. I don't know if anybody's ever going to have, realistic figures, but I can tell you this, it's always worse than we think,
Right.
the amount of people that are killed.
Okay.
So that was 1949, and then in 1950 and 51, you have the Korean War. This was a globalist operation. It was run under UN auspices. China, of course, was the instigator of that, got North Korea to cross the 38th parallel and attack South Korea. And when the U.S. finally reacted and reeled back from that, and through the, then the Chinese entered the war and started pouring across the Yalu River in support of the North Koreans, drove the U.S. clear back down to the Pusan harbor in southern South Korea. And that's when MacArthur, who was chosen to lead the charge back, had his famous Incheon landing up near Seoul, where he essentially came around the backside of the Chinese invasion and came in through Seoul and then cut across their path and cut them off. And so this was a tremendous. The only reason he pulled this off, by the way, because the United Nations was running this operation, and they always had a Soviet general in charge of the UN military operations. So obviously, whenever and MacArthur complained bitterly about this to the Truman administration. Truman hated Marshall, called him a dumb general, and said, above all, in his memoirs, he said, the thing I didn't like about Roosevelt, he disrespected my leadership. And of course he did, because he wasn't allowed to run the war and win the war because of the politicians in Washington. They kept sabotaging their ability. So when the Incheon landing and they pushed the Chinese, and by the way, I want to say that when the U.S. first entered the war with MacArthur, they pushed the North Koreans clear up to North Korea, and that's when the Chinese entered the war and then pushed the Americans back south again. And the U.S., of course, were developing jets at this time, so we had the F-86 jet fighter. We also had a lot of Mustangs and A-1 Sky Raiders, which were very, very effective at bombing. We had total air superiority over the North Koreans and the Chinese, and that's why we were winning the war. But as soon as MacArthur pushed them back to the 38th parallel, or is it the 50-something parallel? I may be mistaken on that. In any case, the current demarcation line, what does the UN do? Call a truce, a ceasefire, so that you don't defeat the communists or the North Koreans. And this is done for preservation of future conflict creation. As that's all the globalist purpose is build enemies, create conflict, and then come to a stalemate where you do not win the war. And that creates a future conflict.
Do you think it's true that MacArthur was frustrated and wanted to just finish it with nuclear weapons after that? Or is that just a story that somebody tells?
I don't know of any credible information. I'm sure that MacArthur, being a military strategist, would be willing to use nuclear weapons, especially on big troop concentrations of the Chinese. I know he wanted to bomb the bridges across the Yalu River to stop the Chinese infiltration. And just as in Vietnam, which we'll discuss, you weren't allowed to bomb any of the supply bases on the Yalu River or the bridges of the Yalu River. I mean, clearly, these people did not want the U.S. to win the war. And so that was another betrayal in Korea in 1951. Then the next thing comes up in 1958 is the communist takeover of Cuba. And that was also a giveaway by a combination, and I might say in all of these betrayals, you have a combination of communists in the State Department, globalists who protect them from being fired somewhere higher up in the administration, and you have journalists who are globalists who are pro-communist. In other words, in the Cuba incident, we had Herbert Matthews of the New York Times, who was continually putting out the propaganda that Castro is a reformer, he's not a communist. Right up into the day of the communist takeover, he was saying, this is not a communist revolution. Even when Castro declared himself a communist, Herbert Matthews was in denial of that and saying, I wasn't wrong, he just wasn't a communist, and he doesn't know the terms. Continued to excuse him continually during this time. The ambassador Mario Lasso of Cuba in the earlier period documented in his book, Dagger in the Heart, American Foreign Policy Failures in Cuba by Mario Lasso. It's the most complete documentary of all of the negotiation and the attempts that he did to inform the Eisenhower administration and the State Department that Castro was a communist. And he was rebuffed. The State Department wouldn't listen to him. He even sent emissaries, friends in the military to talk directly to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower kind of played dumb at the thing and kept listening to the State Department, did nothing. So clearly the government was warned that this was a communist revolution and did nothing to stop it. Now we find out that the CIA actually shipped arms and weapons to Castro surreptitiously. So this was actually directly a globalist black operation to arm Castro. Then came the disastrous Bay of Pigs operation during the Kennedy administration. And it's interesting that the Bay of Pigs was the white side of the CIA. Now, in every one of these agencies, even at that time, there's a dark side and a white side.
It's been going on for a while.
Yeah, the dark side of the deep state, part of the CIA, was one who was shipping arms secretly to Castro. And then the white side decided to overthrow Castro, and they developed the Bay of Pigs through working through Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua to host a lot of the air force that would be accumulated to do this. I think the U.S. should have done it openly rather than, doing it with Cubans using the other. I mean, you had the Monroe Doctrine, which was still in effect at that time. They could have justified going in and saying, we're not going to allow a communist dictatorship in Cuba and thrown him out.
Right.
But the Bay of Pigs, as designed by the white side of the CIA, would have worked had the air power been allowed to go forward to keep Castro's Air Force from destroying the invasion forces on the ground, which came in through boats. John Kennedy went to bed the night before the Bay of Pigs disaster, having authorized the air power to be on board. And during the night, when Kennedy was sleeping, McGeorge Bundy, a globalist, part of his Harvard think tank that he brought into his administration along with McNamara, McGeorge Bundy canceled the air power. And Kennedy was so enraged when he got up the next morning and found out what a disaster the Bay of Pigs had been and that the air power had been canceled, that he vowed at that time, I'm going to destroy these secret operations of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that signed his death warrant, is he was going after the black operations of the CIA or the deep state in that day and age.
Right.
And they decided they'd have to kill him. Now, I think they also killed Kennedy for the purpose of a martyr syndrome. his entire legislative package of new socialist legislation was not going anywhere in Congress. As soon as they killed Kennedy, the martyr effect took over, and Johnson was able to pass everything that Kennedy had proposed.
So it was kind of complex. I mean, he was killed for things that he did against the deep state, also including issuing an executive order to supersede the Federal Reserve with his own money. Issuing U.S. notes instead of Federal Reserve.
Well, we're not sure. There really is no hard evidence of that. There was no executive order. There was an intent that he intended to. At least there's rumors of that intent. But we don't have such an executive order. Now, you've got to remember that John F. Kennedy was put into office by the globalists. His father was a very compromised individual who made his money in bootlegging and liquor, and as ambassador to Britain was very complicit in the World War II conspiracies that were going on at the time. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, used his money, of course, to get his father elected, used his money along with the mafia to twist arms among the Catholic and mafia communities in order to get votes out for Jack Kennedy. And Jack Kennedy was very much aware that he was put in by the powers that be. But he was honest enough, not being an actual member, a conspiring member of them, that when he saw these things, like the Bay of Pigs fiasco and someone superseding his orders in the night, that's what made him mad, and he went after them. And it's like his brother Robert F. Kennedy before him. Now, these are not good people in the sense. These were Democrats. These were semi-socialist people. These were immoral people. Jack Kennedy was grossly immoral, not only with Marilyn Monroe, but almost nightly. He would complain to his advisors that if he didn't have sex every night, he would get migraine headaches.
Right.
And so they would continue to ply him with prostitutes, and he had, relationships with one of his secretaries and anyone he could get his hands on, basically. He was a sex addict.
Yeah. I guess the martyr thing really worked, because even now people are thinking of him as one of the greatest presidents ever. And he did have a certain amount of sincerity, but also I wanted to put in just for a second, for people that aren't totally familiar with what the Bay of Pigs actually was, can you give a couple of sentences as an overview to that so that they'll know what you're referring to?
Well, the Bay of Pigs was the location of the invasion force, which the CIA had put together of Cuban dissidents from Miami and from who had also escaped to other places in Central America, had put them in. And this was where the boats were going to land at the Bay of Pigs. And they were slaughtered on that landing because our Air Force the makeshift Air Force that was put together based in Nicaragua was not allowed to take off to be able to defend those beaches. So that's why the Bay of Pigs invasion force died on the slopes, and Castro declared a great victory.
But it was an invasion that Kennedy was supporting and helping to organize, right?
Well, he okayed it. He didn't actually help organize it. He okayed it, the CIA, to do it. He knew it was being formed, and when it was brought to him the night before the invasion about whether or not to cancel the air power, because, of course, the second floor of the State Department was screaming bloody murder when they found out about this invasion force, and they were trying to do everything to sabotage it. And that's when he said, no, the military says it's got to have that air power or the invasion force. And Kennedy said, yep, the air power is a go. And
so it was to overthrow Castro.
Castro. Right.
And that was a completely illegal operation, I assume. That's a foreign country.
Well, it was a communist takeover, Soviet-backed communist takeover of a country which violated the Monroe Doctrine. So the U.S. had already declared the right to intervene there. But in order to avoid that, they had used Cubans. They had financed Cubans to run the Air Force and the operation, so that made it legal. They could actually go through and overthrow a country that had overthrown their country.
Right, so it was like Cuban rebels were revolting against Castro, backed by U.S. funds and
that's exactly right.
Air power and stuff.
That's exactly right. Now, you remember that the only reason Castro was able to come to power is that the U.S. State Department was able to cut off all military aid to Batista, just like they had done to Chiang Kai-shek in China. So this is the second time they'd done that. Brought in a communist government by cutting off all military aid to Batista's forces. And sure, Batista wasn't perfect. He had some corruption issues too. Almost all of these regime changes did. But look at Castro. I mean, look at what you brought in instead. You know,
if the deep state wanted to bring in Castro, why would they back the invasion to overthrow him?
It wasn't the deep state. It was the white side of the CIA that you see, there's always competing sides to these organizations. There are not anymore, because the higher ups of all of these alphabet organizations, whether it's NSA, CIA, or FBI, are all controlled by deep state. In those days, they weren't necessarily.
Okay.
In fact, you know, when Dulles and even George H.W. Bush took over the CIA, that was deep state control of the CIA.
So the attempted invasion was like a proxy war between the two sides of the CIA.
Yes, it was. That's right. And remember, at that time, after World War II, the white side of the CIA was bigger than the dark side.
Right.
So you have somebody like Dulles come over and try to control the CIA. You're still dealing with a lot of people that you can't say, hey, we're going to put Castro into power. He couldn't say that. He had to work through the dark side. He had to play on the as if he were on the white side, saying like, we support and everything. So it gets very, very complicated when you have these kinds of dual allegiances within these. Now, the only people on the white side of the CIA and the FBI are the little administrative lower agents. And they have a lot of Mormons they recruit into the CIA because they're patriotic Americans. They see no evil. And they go along with this stuff. They believe in supporting and being good yes men. And so that's the problem. But they're very astute about bringing people into the white side of the FBI and CIA who will be patriotic and non-thinking and non-observant of the dark side activities going on.
Now, you said to bring people into the good side who would be non-observant of the bad side, right? Did I understand that right?
Yes, or, you know, yes men to the organization. And you have to keep them in the younger levels, the lower levels to do that. Because once you get up into the higher supervisory levels, you start to see that there's some illegal activities going on. You can't keep that from their hires. And so it's, for example, when I was graduating from college, when Bay of Pigs occurred, and my brother Mark went into the CIA as an economic analyst, I had other friends who went into the CIA as well, and they told me one time that they were sent overseas to Europe. And one night, prostitutes showed up at every one of their separate hotel room doors, courtesy of the CIA, paid for by the government. And the ones that accepted those prostitutes got advanced. The ones that rejected them, that showed they had moral principles, never got advanced. And that shows you, you see, that they're screening people even during the younger years of your association in the CIA to see who can be compromised in the principles. Because you don't bring them into the dark side unless they prove that they're willing to compromise moral principles. So that's how the CIA operates. At the higher levels, you always have to have proof of being compromised morally, because the illegal activities that you'll engage in the dark side are going to be very obvious to everyone, and that's why they always have to be on board of these of the compromise of the moral principles. And one of the things that they used to use was being immoral with a prostitute, or being unfaithful to your wife. Now it's moved into more, since that's so ubiquitous, it's moved into pedophilia, homosexuality, and deviant sexual behavior as a more sure way of keeping people under control and making sure you always have blackmail. Not that you use it, but if you have to someday, if they get cold feet, you want to bring up that blackmail, and that's why they have cameras and tape record people. That's why the Jeffrey Epstein affairs, that was a pornography and pedophilia mill in order to get people under camera of high. And that's why we've never seen any of those people prosecuted. But I'm jumping ahead. We'll get into that in the future.
Yeah. Let's
move now to the Vietnam War, which is the next thing on our schedule. This was something that came about because of French losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to the communists. The left likes to portray the U.S. initial involvement in Vietnam was supporting colonialization in the French colony of Vietnam, but in fact it was because this was a communist attack on Vietnam and the threat of South Vietnam or all of Vietnam becoming communist that we intervened. All throughout this war, we fought, and this was a war in which I entered the military as a Marine Corps fighter pilot. I flew F-4s. I didn't actually go into Vietnam because my squadron had just come back from Vietnam when I joined it, and the war was winding down in the early 70s by that time. But I knew enough from talking to my colleagues that we were fighting this war with one hand tied behind our back. We couldn't bomb any of the missile sites. We couldn't bomb any of the key bridges. We had, it wasn't until the later part of the war that we had the Wild Weasel fighters, both in the Air Force and the Marine Corps, where you'd take F-4s and you'd come in and lure in the missiles, and then you'd have certain other aircraft that would home in on with a guided missile, home in on the radar, and then you could blow up the missile batteries. And it was very, very difficult for the SAM sites to really stay up. They'd have to shut down their radar when we had a missile on the rail going down toward them. Toward the first part of the war, of course, we lost a lot of aircraft to SAMs because they were off limits, that we couldn't attack the SAM batteries. It was just, and there was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was, or Laos, that was off limits. And so the Vietnamese were told that you could have all these supply bases right. It was like the Yalu River in Korea all over again. You couldn't bomb on the other side of the river. And so we would have bombing runs all day long, all night long on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but you couldn't get them on the supply depots where you could really do a lot of damage. You had to wait for the trucks to get on the Ho Chi Minh Trail before you could bomb them. And a lot of those were traps as well. When they would shoot down our aircraft, they'd know we'd come in to try to rescue the pilots, and so they would set up anti-aircraft to be able to shoot down the helicopters and capture more people.
So were the restrictions for the sake of just having a prolonged war with no outcome?
Well, in the overall scheme of things, I think this is what the globalists wanted. This was the last war that they wanted Americans to fight to liberate the world from communism. They wanted to poison Americans about this fight against communism, and that's what the Vietnam War did. Remember, there were no yellow ribbons during the Vietnam War. There were no campaigns about supporting our troops. That only happened after the globalist wars of intervention started, when they wanted to harness this knee-jerk pro-patriotism, pro-military views of the conservatives into supporting globalist neocon objectives. And so that's when they started the campaign of everything about our military is glorious. Every time I walk into the store with my military cap on, you get, thank you for your service, thank you for your service, as if, because we've been propagandized that we're serving in the liberty of our country.
Right.
But that's not what's happening. We're serving globalist agendas now in intervention. But in those days, we weren't serving in the interest of our country. We were serving in the interest of the free people of South Vietnam. And the globalists wanted to sabotage that war. They wanted to embitter the people against it. There was even the Gulf of Tonkin false flag started the war. We wouldn't have got involved directly in the war had they not falsified the attack on the U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. And there was no attack, in fact. They made it up.
So they allowed the anti-war protests of the Vietnam era because it would demonize the troops and the fight against communism so that they could get rid of people's antipathy toward the communist approach to life?
Get rid of people's being in favor of intervening to stop communist growth. They wanted that stopped. We have to remember that there was that entire period in the 60s of the which was going on actually just before 50s and 60s, where you had all these colonies in Africa that were the Europeans decided to rid themselves of the colonies. So they got rid of the British had to get rid of Mozambique and South Africa. The Germans had to get rid of Southwest Africa or Namibia, and they turned them all over to communist governments. Every single one of them. Mozambique went to Frelimo. Angola went to the communists there, with Jonas Savimbi was fighting with all during the 70s. And the South Africans were turned over to the ANC, where the ANCs were fighting, and they had the sanctions on South Africa, all demonizing South Africa until they gave them over to the ANC. Now you have a communist dictatorship taking away all the farmers' land. That's what happened in Rhodesia. We made British give up Rhodesia, turned into Zimbabwe, a real basket case with Robert Mugabe, who just recently died. You had Nelson Mandela. He and his wife were communist guerrillas. They killed many, many people. Winnie Mandela was the famous woman for necklacing people, putting a tire filled with gasoline around the neck of anti-communist blacks. And
isn't it interesting that Mandela became an international hero?
Yes. And this is typical. You give Nobel Peace Prizes to people, who are communist, evil guerrillas who kill innocent people. At the end of the Vietnam War, they gave Kissinger and Mr. Tho of the North Vietnamese the Nobel Peace Prize.
And recently, Mao was called the most inspiring national leader in the world, recent history, I guess, by somebody in the U.S.
But in essence, the United States military continued to play this game with the politicians, trying to win the war, at least trying to show that they were winning the war by increasing, sometimes falsifying the body count. The military was somewhat complicit in the politicians, being drummed into them all during these times that you have to go along with the politicians. Even Colin Powell, the general who became Secretary of State during the Iraq War, he covered up for the Mylar massacre. He was the head company commander over that issue and covered that up when it happened. And there was frustration among the soldiers. I'm not saying it justified that massacre of killing women and children, but they would get ambushed regularly when they would go into villages and be invited in and then and get trapped. But what really won the war is finally the U.S. military got permission to go after the SAM sites in North Vietnam, and they did a good job of that. They still weren't able to hit North Vietnam City or Hanoi properly until the Hanoi bombing started with the Air Force toward the end of the war in the 70s. And it actually, even though we lost a lot of B-52s to SAMs, and I'll tell you, a SAM is really horrendous. It looks like a telephone pole coming up at you when you're a fighter. And they're not all that maneuverable, the SAM-2s, that were used, but it's like a telephone pole with a flame at the end of it coming out toward you. And it's just a huge missile, and, you learn to evade it and could be successful most of the time. But the B-52s could not maneuver. And so a lot of B-52s got shot down, but we pulverized Hanoi, and that's what really brought them to the peace table, the Paris peace talks. They were recalcitrant even at the peace talks. However, they wanted essentially all U.S. military aid, all U.S. military was leaving. And finally, Kissinger in 1973 gave in to their demands. And what is the true betrayal of Vietnam by Henry Kissinger, and it's more than what's ever told in the history books. China was involved in those Paris peace talks, and the U.S. never allowed the military to bomb the harbor of Haiphong, where Chinese and Russian ships were bringing in all this material and weaponry into North Vietnam. I mean, what other war do you play where you're not allowed to bomb the supply chain? I mean, look at World War II. We bombed their cities. We bombed, their manufacturing. We bombed their railroads. That's how you win a war, not the cities, because that was one of the war crimes of Churchill and Eisenhower's bombing civilian city centers, which they had no reason to do other than to terrorize the population, which was really a war crime. But in Hanoi, it was a war crime not to bomb the Russian and Chinese ships that were bringing in. They should have been on notice, or we're going to bomb you if you come in. But it was during this period that, George Kennan had developed the doctrine of containment. That is, we contain, so because it's a nuclear power. Now, remember, why is it a nuclear power? Because we gave them the plans to the nuclear weapons and the enriched uranium. We taught them how to do the bomb, so that now we could say to our own people, now we can't fight the Soviet Union because it's mutually assured destruction.
Right. And when you say we, who do you specifically mean? I know it's the country, but within America, who was behind that?
Well, there was the McNamara's, the McGeorge Bundy, the Averill Harriman, the Dean Acheson. All these were globalists. Alger Hiss. These are the people. Henry Kissinger, was a globalist. Interestingly, he went and joined the Communist Party in East Germany when he was there as a soldier during World War II.
Wow.
And he never was a communist, even though he joined the Communist Party, just like Alger Hiss. As I pointed out numerous times in my World Affairs brief, the reason he joined the Communist Party, the reason that Alger Hiss joined the Communist Party as a globalist, was to make the communists think that as he's working for them or appearing to working for them, that he's one of them, so they wouldn't think, hey, this is strange. What's he doing our bidding for? He isn't one of our guys. So all during these years where Kissinger was giving it away at the Paris Peace, the communists were saying, he's one of our guys. He wasn't really. He's a globalist who believes in building up a future enemy in China and North Vietnam and destroying a military success, creating conflict so that you can have future wars to justify future destruction of national sovereignty. So at the Paris peace talks, Henry Kissinger did several things, very, very evil. Number one, he agreed to North Vietnamese terms that he would withdraw American troops and military aid to North Vietnam in exchange for them not attacking for 2 years.
You mean withdraw military aid from South Vietnam, right?
From South Vietnam, if the North Vietnamese would refrain from invading the country for 2 years. Now, that's not part of the public agreement, but that was part of the secret agreement.
2 years, that's not very long.
That's right. And that's why in 1975, the North Vietnam, after receiving billions of tons of supplies from the Soviet Union, attacked and went through with 15 divisions into North Vietnam and conquered the country in 55 days. The South Vietnamese were out of ammunition, out of gasoline. They didn't have anything to run their fighter airplanes. It was just, it was a great destruction. And Kissinger also agreed with China that they would give them a seat in the Security Council of the United Nations and oust Taiwan. That went on at the Paris peace talks as well. And so Kissinger was truly a globalist, betraying his own country at that time, and he continued to serve globalist things throughout the Nixon administration. Now, it's interesting that President Thieu of South Vietnam refused to sign the Paris Peace Accords until Kissinger and Nixon continued to threaten him. He only acceded to sign the accords once Nixon agreed that he would bring U.S. military power to bear if North Vietnamese didn't honor their agreement. And of course, that was a paper promise that was never fulfilled. When Hanoi invaded, the U.S. refused to come in and help, and we let it happen.
Wow. So what he was offering in exchange for the signature was to guarantee that you do get 2 years before you're destroyed.
No, that wasn't part of the public agreement. Public agreement did not mention the 2 years. That's what Kissinger said. Don't embarrass us by invading right away. Give us 2 years,
I see. But what he privately offered the president of South Vietnam was that if you'll just sign this agreement, then we'll protect you with U.S. military if the North invades.
We'll protect you from North Korean and North Vietnamese invasion, and that was simply a lie.
Okay. And what he told him is not just for 2 years, but indefinitely.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay.
The 2 years was never publicly, known, but whistleblowers from the Paris Peace Conference heard Kissinger say that, don't embarrass us, give us 2 years before you take back that country.
And it
so
was proven by what happened.
Yeah, 1973 it was signed. In 1975, that's when North Vietnam went in and took back the country. So this was a great evil day in American diplomacy. During the Nixon administration, that's when Henry Kissinger gave away the miniature ball-bearing technology to the Soviet Union. He agreed to sell them the miniature ball-bearing technology that the U.S. had exclusive rights on, which allowed them to miniaturize the gyroscopes on the missiles and allowed them to MIRV their warheads. MIRV means multiple independent reentry vehicles, so that now the Soviet Union could have more than one nuclear weapon on their missiles, which prior to this time they only had one. Now they could put up to 10 or 5 to 10 warheads, because they now had these independent gyroscopes that could guide each warhead to its target independently. Kissinger gave that away.
And then how did that get to China?
Well, of course, Russia gives it to China.
Okay, because on some level they were allies.
Yeah, I mean, they're temporary allies in taking down the West. The Russians have given up until the last 10 years, where they've started to restrict exports of high technology to China, because now Russia fears China as an ultimate enemy to them. Even though they're both communists, they know that China and Russia will have to go head to head over who's going to have dominion over the world. So they're temporarily aligned to take down the West, but they intend to fight each other someday. And that's why Russia stopped any export of top-of-the-line weapons to China. Now, in the period, so Kissinger, by the way, used to keep doctors having mood-altering drugs given to Nixon during the latter part of his administration, so that he was kind of out of it most of the time, so that Kissinger could be allowed to make most of the decisions in his stead. They came out in one of the books of the journalist about that time period, that Nixon was kept on mood-altering drugs most of the time. Now, when Kissinger was taken out of office, of course, you had, Kennedy come in. You had the assassination of President Kennedy. This was a deep state operation. This was most of the hitmen on the grassy knoll were from the mafia. One of those mafia people admitted on his deathbed that he took part in the shooting from the grassy knoll, that he was the shooter, and he documented in detail where he got it, and there was CIA involved in that. There's a seamless relationship between the mafia and the CIA. And that's where Robert F. Kennedy got killed eventually, is that he started going after the mafia, and the CIA, the deep state, only wanted, the government to go after selected mafia people that the mafia said, yeah, he's getting out of line.
Right.
But you always protect the big guy. You only take down the little guys. Well, Robert F. Kennedy was going after them all, and that's why he had to be killed. Martin Luther King was killed, I believe, mostly for the martyr effect. He was, in fact, in that Memphis hotel having an orgy that night. And so, people really knew. I talked to Deputy Director Gray when I was chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C., after Hoover had died. And I said, what are in those 15 file cabinets that the government put in the National Archives and sealed for 50 years? What's in them that the government wants sealed? And he said, well, about 13 of those 15 file cabinets are on his pornographic sexual activities, our surveillance of those activities, tapes and videotapes of him dealing with prostitutes. 13 out of 15 file cabinets. Only 2 of the file cabinets are about his communist connections. And they are real. And that's what was sealed up. And that 50 years has passed, by the way, and the judge has still not released those file cabinets. So desperate are they to keep the image of Martin Luther King. So I believe that Martin Luther King was killed for the martyr effect. In other words, he was going to be, it was getting increasingly difficult to protect the public from the view of his chronic sexual immorality and the hypocrisy of his claiming to be a minister of God. Even at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, where they typically give a communist fellow traveler like Martin Luther King the Peace Prize, he was having an orgy the entire night before with Swedish prostitutes. And So it was getting harder and harder to cover up. So they figured we're better off by killing him, because that's when we can get the Civil Rights Act passed out of backlash against the killing of Martin, to blame it on a right-wing person. And he was a patsy set up. Even the Martin Luther King family believed after a period of time that the patsy was not the actual killer. They finally came to the conclusion the government had killed Martin Luther King.
Okay, so you said this is to get the Civil Rights Act passed.
That's right.
And most people are thinking, wow, the Civil Rights Act, that's something wonderful. Are you saying the deep state wanted to help everybody?
No, not at all. The Civil Rights Act contains a very bad provision. It's not just that government can't discriminate, which would have been appropriate, because government has to represent all the people.
Right.
But the Civil Rights Act also declared, or at least the courts declared, that private business property, private people, and could not discriminate on the basis of race. Now, this is a violation of people's fundamental right to choose. And remember those signs in restaurants, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Right. That's what destroyed that, finally. Private business, private property could no longer discriminate. And that took away and stripped away a major fundamental property right that people... And I was one of the few conservatives in the 80s that when they were celebrating the annual civil rights passage, right, I went on television and said, the reason why I'm against the Civil Rights Act is that it violates fundamental rights. Well, how does the civil right violate them? Because it violates your right to associate or disassociate with people on your own property. And I said, that's a fundamental right. If you don't have the right to exclude people from your property, for whatever reason, it's like free speech. You may disagree with what people have to say, but you have to defend to the death their right to say it.
Yeah, and the ultimate evolution of that was making everything hate speech like it is now, right?
That's right. And now anti-discrimination laws, and they start adding people to the protected list. Homosexuals, gay, lesbians. You cannot refuse to do business. You can't refuse to bake a cake for a lesbian marriage. You can't do any of that. That's all based on the civil rights law, where they enroded into your fundamental right to exclude by association.
And you can't even use the certain words that they say.
Well, now it's got to. That's right, but you can't.
Yeah, I should have asked you what pronouns you wanted me to use before we started, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then when we moved into the 70s, of course, we had Jimmy Carter elected president. And this was the closest thing to a Woodrow Wilson type election by the globalist. Although they didn't necessarily have any sexual impropriety against Jimmy Carter, I think he was faithful to his wife. Wilson had been immoral at Princeton, and so he was. They had him under the gun, a blackmail. But Jimmy Carter was kind of a naive liberal that they could simply snooker into doing a lot of things, and that's why we lost so many countries. We lost all the African countries to communism during Jimmy Carter. We lost the war against Angolan communists and Frelimo, during the war. And worst of all, we lost Nicaragua to the communists during the war. And this was very similar to the destruction of Cuba. You had a very powerful strongman government, Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua. Wasn't perfect, but he actually wasn't guilty of all the things that they claim. Once again, you had a New York Times communist, Herbert Matthews, that was decrying Somoza and saying bad things about him and making him appear awful. And he was glorifying the Sandinistas as a non-communist revolutionary group. And you had the cutoff of military aid to Somoza so that the Sandinistas, who were directly funded by the Soviet Union and Castro's Cuba, was finally able to win the battle. Somoza was refused entry to Miami, where he had a residence by President Carter. He went to Paraguay, where he was assassinated by a Sandinista hit team. And the U.S. CIA knew about it, didn't warn Somoza. They wanted him dead because he wrote a book, Nicaragua Betrayed, which is the greatest book about every conversation he had with the U.S. government, how they promised him things, they betrayed him. Wow. It's an amazing book by Anastasio Somoza.
Nicaragua betrayed.
That's right.
And it's available still now?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And so that takes us up in through the Carter regime, and I think this is a good place to break into the modern period now, where you start with Ronald Reagan's election, which went against what the globalists wanted, and how they controlled the Reagan administration. I think that's a good place to break, where we can start that in the next episode of what I would call the modern era of the deep state, and going through, the war on terrorism, the Bush years, and where we are today.
Okay. I do have one question about a general theme that ran through today's discussion and previously as well. And that is this whole idea, people use words, all of us, all the time, that we might not have an exact comprehension of what they actually mean. Nowadays, people are seeing a spectrum between communism, supposedly on the left, fascism on the right, and I don't think it's that clear cut. Because regimes that are considered fascist are often actually socialist or communist. And it actually just gets down to, it seems, tyranny versus freedom. Do you think that's accurate?
Absolutely. The left is the one that created the new left-right paradigm, which is absolutely wrong. The only paradigm that makes any difference is no government to total government control.
All right. Okay.
All right, so you have everything on the left is heavy to extreme government control. It's on the left. And so Hitler's National Socialism, it's on the left. And it's the left who actually said, no, we want Hitler on the right because he was nationalist. All right, in other words, anything nationalist has to be conservative, but it's not. Nationalism wasn't the issue. It's how much government control. You could be super nationalist as the Soviet Union were, as Putin is in Russia. That doesn't put you on the right, do you see? The right has to be less government control. And so anarchy has to be the furthest extreme right. Libertarians are next. And then the Constitution is pretty much in the center, just the right balance between government having limited powers and most of the power to state governments alone. And I don't think the Constitution goes far enough. I think there ought to be a Constitution of liberty where no government, local, state, or federal, can violate fundamental rights.
Yeah, right now it's just federal, isn't it?
That's right. And even that's been undermined.
Right.
You've got to remember that the reason that the federal government got so much power was because the states were exempted from the Bill of Rights. And so the states began immediately after the ratification of the Constitution to have state churches, state corporations, competing against private companies. And so, the states even had an extermination order against the Mormons in Missouri that was on the books until 1976, when Missouri was embarrassed to find they still had an extermination order on the books for all Mormons. And with great fanfare, they did away with that ordinance and apologized to the church on that. Wow. But you see, the point is, it's because of the state running rampant without the restrictions of a Bill of Rights that caused people to say the federal government has to step in and stop the states from violating rights. And that's how the federal government got a lot of power. Then, of course, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War consolidated a lot more of that power. But I am in favor of making sure that no government can destroy your property rights or take away your right to discriminate. That's a fundamental right, like the right of free speech. We've lost the right of privacy, but that's getting into the modern times.
We'll do that next time.
But the spectrum is absolutely correct, as you say. Fascism is a type of socialism whereby you don't have government ownership, you have private ownership, but government control of property. Fascism has nothing to do with racism. They've equated that because of Hitler becoming anti-Semitic. So fascism does not mean anti-Semitism. Fascism is a form of socialism. It is Fabian socialism. Was it correct
what Mussolini said about fascism being the cooperation between, or merging together between government and corporate power, kind of ruling together?
Government control over private corporations. That's what it really means.
Yeah.
In other words, private corporations, private property, but government control. And that's fascism. That's Fabian socialism.
Okay, so in the stages that we've gone over so far, it started with more white hats in the U.S. government that had to be gotten rid of, and in the white hat predomination period, they were going after communist governments because they were tyrannies, at least ideally. But that had to get switched around so that the U.S. could come into alignment with communism, right? And that's why the Vietnam War was demonized?
No, it's not why. Globalism will always be anti-communist. But globalism itself is socialist. It's Fabian socialist. It believes in a more hidden form of socialism. They'll still, like the EU Constitution, they still tell you you're free, you have property rights, you have family rights, you have all of these rights, except, there's all this except when the state needs the property, when the state needs to intervene, except when the state needs to, So there's all these exceptions, so there are no absolute rights, but they continue to parade them as if they are, and that's the deception of globalism. They don't want the ruthlessness of communism, which is so obvious that it riles people up. They want to lull people to sleep with you're still free, you're still a sovereign country, but now, like the EU, we control you.
So they don't really dislike what underlies communism in terms of tyranny. They just think it's too obvious. Is that right?
They want to have tyranny of democracy or democratic tyranny, where they control the media. Therefore, they control education, so they can control people's ideas. Look at the millennials growing up, all socialists now because they're being propagandized in public schools.
Right.
And then censorship of the media, so that the reaction from the libertarians and the true conservatives and the constitutionalists cannot gain traction through censorship in the media. And of course, the mother of all threats to the globalism, the conspiracy theories and facts, can never reach the people, and that's what we're trying to break through with this series here.
Exactly, and the projected focus of the next episode, you said once. Tell me again what we're looking for. Will
be the modern period from Reagan to the present time.
Right, Reagan to now. Okay, exciting. This is like the old cliffhangers that they did during the 40s, I guess, in the movie theaters, when the hero's just about to fall off a cliff and you say, and next week we'll have the exciting conclusion. Well, not really the exciting conclusion, because we've got a few more things to talk about, but at least coming up to modern times, that's going to be good.
Okay.
So, okay, hold on, and we'll say goodbye in the break here. Okay, everybody, there goes Joel Skousen, editor of World Affairs Brief. And remember the offer that he confirmed, which is you write to editor@worldaffairsbrief.com and request a free copy of his newsletter, and he'll send you one, and it's a good one. I've read it myself. Author of The Secure Home and Strategic Relocation, a really good book about places that will be better to be when things are difficult, particularly in America, but I know he's done consulting for people all over the world. That's what I have heard. Talking about the deep state in this series with us, and that was the Cold War years, and we're coming up on the next one shortly, which will be the more of the modern period. I don't know the exact title that Joel will choose from it or for it, but incredible opportunity for all of us to learn a bit of real history, which is getting harder and harder to locate these days. Remember to stay in touch with us on lostartsradio.com and get on our mailing list if you want to. It doesn't cost any money, and it means if we get knocked off the air due to some of the controversial content of all this stuff, that we'll be able to send you things and stay in touch anyway. And in addition to going to our channel at brighteon.com/channel/Lost Arts Radio. Brighteon is brighteon.com/channel/Lost Arts Radio. And in general, it's good to support brighteon.com by watching videos there, because that makes them stronger when they get more views, and they're coming up with more features on their site, trying to compete with the big platforms they're just adding in subscription. So you can go there and subscribe to lostartsradio.com or Lost Arts Radio channel on Brighteon, or any other channels that you like there. A lot of content is posted there that is not allowed on the major platforms. That's really educational. Strongly suggest you take a look at that and put that on your normal places to watch videos. So watch for our normal Sunday shows, finishing the series with Joel, and also other inspiring people and organizations that are educational that we want to share. We have a Subscribe Star page in case you have any resources and want to help us stay on the air. That would be appreciated and eventually build toward the school that we want to construct. That's at subscribestar.com/LostArtsRadio. Let's see what else. Also, Planetary Healing Club, of course, where we get together if you want to go into more depth on some of these issues that can be applied and used personally on an interactive, somewhat more protected forum on another platform that we pay for. Go to planetaryhealingclub.com, planetaryhealingclub.com. That's an access point to it. If you have any questions about that group, feel free to email questions to me, Richard at LostArtsRadio.com, or if you're interested in the limited private one-on-one Skype sessions that I do, sharing some of this information that's more personalized, you can ask me about that on email too, Richard at LostArtsRadio.com, and watch for other videos that we'll put up during the week as time allows. I think that's about it, and hopefully you enjoyed the session and got a lot from it that I did too. And I'm really looking forward to the next one. So in between now and then, hope you have a great week. Everything goes really well for you, and we'll see you next time.
Introducing Lost Arts Radio on Subscribestar.com. Just go to subscribestar.com/LostArtsRadio to find our rewards program, offering 10 different giving levels starting at just $5 a month. We offer incredible value for any rewards level, from extra monthly interview videos not available publicly to subscription-based Planetary Healing Club videos once, twice, or 3 times a month, to private counseling sessions with Lost Arts Radio host Richard Sachs, to tech help with me, Doug Diamond. We even have one option where you can be the star on Lost Arts Radio as our guest on a specially produced show just for you. We conduct an interview with you and broadcast it to our growing network and listenership. Our Subscribe Star levels are one of a kind and offer great rewards for any budget. Please help support Lost Arts Radio. We can't do it without you. With increasing censorship on many of our channels, we really need your support today to keep doing what we're doing. As Richard says, we're not even at survival level yet. Lost Arts Radio has 3 weekly shows. Lost Arts Radio Live each Saturday night at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific, which is a live stream currently on multiple platforms in case we get banned from some of the larger ones. Right now, we're on 2 YouTube channels, Facebook Live, Periscope, which is Twitter, Twitch, and DLive. You can access these broadcasts by going to www.lostartsradio.com/live for all the links to those channels. The Planetary Healing Club meets right after Lost Arts Radio Live at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on Saturday nights. And our Sunday show with guests airs at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on Sunday nights on our Blog Talk Radio channel, our YouTube channels, Facebook pages, and on Brighteon. Be sure to sign up for our free email list just in case we do get banned on big tech's platforms. It's just a matter of time, really. They don't like the stuff we talk about, and they do not want the truth out there. In fact, they have already attacked us numerous times. Join our free email list so we can let you know where we are and how to access our shows. The sign up button is right on the top right on most pages of our website. The best starting point for all things Lost Arts Radio is our main site, LostArtsRadio.com, where you can find the hottest news selection videos that we curate just for you. Those are on the homepage and added to daily, as well as articles and breaking news about information you really need to know. Our show archives, the 10 most recent shows, are right on our homepage, as well as our Blog Talk Radio page at blogtalkradio.com/LostArtsRadio, or just click the All Things Radio Show tab right on our website. We're in the podcast directory on iTunes, and all of our shows except the banned ones are on our YouTube channels at Lost Arts Radio and at Diamond Disc. Our Brighteon page is really taking off, and we often have editors' picks videos right on their homepage. Visit brighteon.com/channel/LostArtsRadio. On our site, you can also access our free listener forum as well as sign up for the Planetary Healing Club, which is just $25 a month, where you get private access to a one-on-one interaction with host Richard Sachs and myself and the other club members who participate live. More info can be found at planetaryhealingclub.com. We're providing solutions in there to make the world a better place. Come join us. Stay tuned because up next, you'll get to hear a really great song by an independent artist that we're doing our best to support. Go to lostartsradio.com/music for the full list of all the great songs and bands that we spin on our audio-only podcast shows. If you're in a band and want to submit a song for consideration for airplay on Lost Arts Radio, visit my website at diamonddiscaudio.com for more information about the music placement, mastering, and mixing work that I do. Thanks again for listening to and supporting Lost Arts Radio. We love having you as part of our family to learn, experience, and grow with.
Please stop your weeping. I'm only sleeping. I'm not far away from you. Please know that much is true. I'm still here, wishing you were near. Please will you laugh sometime? Then my bright star will shine. Smile like you used to. I will look out for you. I'm still here, wishing you were near. I can hear you crying. Please will you stop? Just keep trying, smiling. You can get through this. Someday you'll be okay. Someday you'll be okay. I'm in your heart always, that much is true. And I'll always love you, I promise you to. Please say goodbye. Don't ask why. I can hear you crying. Please will you stop? Just keep trying, smiling. You can get through this. Someday you'll be okay. Someday you'll be okay. Look at the sky at night, you'll see my star, and then you will know that I'm not really far. Smile, love, and live, 'cause you've got so much to give. I'm asleep. Oh, please don't you weep. Someday you'll be okay. I can hear you crying. Please will you stop? Just keep trying.